The streets of San Francisco had a different feel at night. The usual hustle of tech workers and tourists gave way to an eerie quiet, broken only by the occasional rumble of late-night traffic and the gentle patter of rain against store awnings. For James Wilson, this was the time when the city truly became his home. At 68, James had the kind of face that told stories without saying a word. Deep wrinkles mapped out decades of smiles and worries, while his clear blue eyes held a sparkle that even 3 years of homelessness couldn't dim. He sat in his usual spot, a small alcove near the gleaming high-rises of the financial district, wrapped in his old army blanket, a reminder of prouder days. This particular evening felt different somehow. The rain wasn't the usual San Francisco drizzle, but came down in sheets, causing even the most determined late-night workers to scurry past with their collars turned up. James pulled his blanket tighter, grateful for the small overhang that kept the worst of the rain at bay. His few possessions sat beside him in a weathered backpack, including the one thing he'd never sell, his old toolbox, worn but meticulously maintained. As he watched the rain fall, his mind wandered to warmer times. He thought about his old auto shop in Ohio, where he'd spent over 40 years building a reputation as one of the best mechanics in the state. The memory of engine oil and coffee mixed with the sound of classic rock playing on the radio almost made him smile. Almost. It was funny how life could change so quickly. One day you're helping customers with their cars, and the next you're watching your life's work slip away because of mounting medical bills and a string of bad luck. His wife's cancer had come fast and fierce, taking not just her life, but everything they'd built together. The insurance hadn't been enough. It was never enough. And before he knew it, the shop was gone, the house was gone, and so was his sense of place in the world. The sound of a car's engine interrupted his thoughts, but not the usual smooth purr of late-night traffic. This was the distinctive whine of something expensive in distress. James's ears perked up instinctively, decades of mechanical experience kicking in before he could stop himself. He watched as a sleek Tesla Model S pulled over abruptly about 50 feet from his spot, steam rising from under its hood despite the rain. The car's headlights cut through the rain like spotlights in a theater, illuminating the empty sidewalk and the steam that now billowed more aggressively from the front end. James could tell from the sound alone that it was likely a cooling system issue, probably a burst hose or a failed pump. Simple stuff, really, if you knew what you were doing. He watched as the driver's door opened and a tall figure stepped out into the rain. Even through the downpour, there was something familiar about the man's silhouette. He was talking rapidly into his phone, gesturing with one hand while trying to peer under the hood. The steam continued to rise, creating an almost mystical scene in the glow of the street lights. No, I understand that, but I need to be at this meeting in 20 minutes, the man was saying, his voice carrying through the rain with a distinct intensity. Is there any way to get a service team here faster? James shifted slightly, his joints creaking in protest. He knew he should probably stay put. Most people didn't want help from a homeless man, no matter how well-intentioned. He'd learned that lesson the hard way over the past few years. But something about the scene pulled at him, like an old song you can't help but hum along to. The toolbox seemed to grow heavier beside him, full of the weight of possibility. James had always believed that knowledge was the one thing nobody could take from you. Even now, after everything he'd lost, he still knew every inch of every engine he'd ever worked on. He could probably fix whatever was wrong with that Tesla with his eyes closed, assuming it wasn't one of those computer glitches that seemed to plague modern cars. As he watched, the man ended his call with visible frustration, running his hands through his hair as he looked up and down the empty street. The steam was starting to die down, but James knew that was probably just because the coolant had all leaked out. In this weather, trying to drive any distance without proper cooling would be asking for trouble. James's fingers drummed against his toolbox unconsciously. The old him, the mechanic, the business owner, the problem solver, was itching to get up and help. But the new him, the invisible man, the cautious survivor, knew better than to insert himself into someone else's problems, especially someone who could afford a car like that. Still, as he watched the man pace next to his disabled vehicle, James couldn't shake the feeling that this moment mattered somehow. Maybe it was the unusual quiet of the rain-soaked street, or maybe it was just that he was tired of watching life happen around him instead of to him. Whatever the reason, he found himself slowly gathering his things, careful to keep his precious toolbox dry under his blanket. As he stood up, his knees protesting the movement, James caught his reflection in a darkened shop window. His white beard was neatly trimmed. He still had his pride after all, but his clothes were worn and weather-stained. Not exactly the picture of a master mechanic. But then again, he'd learned long ago that appearances often hid more than they revealed. Taking a deep breath, James began to make his way toward the stranded vehicle. The rain immediately soaked through his layers, but he barely noticed. His focus was entirely on the sound of that engine, his mind already running through the likely causes and solutions. As he got closer, the driver turned toward him, and James's steps faltered for a moment as recognition hit him. Standing there in the rain, looking more human and vulnerable than any of his photos or videos would suggest, was Elon Musk himself. The man whose cars James had studied from afar, fascinated by their innovation, even as he mourned the dying art of traditional auto repair. The whole scene felt surreal, like something from one of those feel-good videos his wife used to love watching. But this wasn't a video, and James wasn't watching from the comfort of his old life. This was real as the rain soaking through his clothes and the weight of his toolbox in his hands. And in that moment, James realized that sometimes the biggest changes in life come not from grand plans or careful preparation, but from simple choices made in unexpected moments. With another deep breath, he stepped forward into the cone of light cast by the Tesla's headlights, his voice rough from lack of use, but still carrying the confidence of decades of experience. "Excuse me, sir. I couldn't help but notice you're having some trouble with your car." Elon Musk turned toward the voice, his expression a mixture of surprise and wariness. The rain continued to pour, creating a curtain of water between the two men. For a moment, neither spoke, the only sound being the gentle pinging of raindrops on the Tesla's hood and the distant rumble of city traffic. James stood his ground, though every instinct told him to retreat. He'd seen that look before, the automatic distrust that came with his appearance. But there was something else in Musk's eyes too, desperation. Even billionaires, it seemed, could find themselves at the mercy of mechanical failures. "I was a mechanic for over 40 years, James continued, his voice gaining strength. "I can tell by the sound and the steam that it's probably your cooling system. I might be able to help if you'd let me take a look." Musk glanced at his phone, then back at James. "I've got Tesla service coming, but they're at least an hour out." He paused, studying the older man more carefully. "You said you were a mechanic?" James nodded, shifting his toolbox to his other hand. "I owned my own shop in Ohio for most of those years. Specialized in foreign cars, but I've kept up with the new technology too. These Teslas," he smiled slightly, "they're something else. Beautiful machines." Something in the way James talked about cars seemed to catch Musk's attention. The wariness in his expression began to fade, replaced by curiosity. "You know about electric vehicles?" "Been studying them since they first hit the market," James replied, taking a careful step forward. "The basic principles haven't changed. It's still about moving parts and heat management. May I?" He gestured toward the hood. After a moment's hesitation, Musk nodded. James set his toolbox down carefully and moved to the front of the car. With practiced ease, he located the hood release and lifted it, positioning the prop rod with the care of someone handling fine china. The steam had lessened, but the problem was immediately apparent to his experienced eyes. "Just as I thought," James muttered, reaching in with careful fingers. "You've got a split in one of your coolant hoses. See here." He pointed to a barely visible crack in one of the tubes. The liquid cooling system in these models is pretty robust, but rubber can still fail, especially with temperature fluctuations. Musk leaned in closer, his interest clearly piqued. "Can it be fixed?" James was already opening his toolbox, the familiar motions bringing back a flood of memories. "Temporarily, yes. I've got some high-temperature silicone tape that should hold until you can get it properly replaced. It won't be pretty, but it'll get you where you need to go." As James worked, his hands moved with the confidence of someone who had done this thousands of times before. He explained each step as he went, not because he needed to, but because it was a habit from decades of keeping customers informed. To his surprise, Musk listened intently, asking detailed questions about the cooling system's design. You really do know your stuff, Musk said, holding his phone's flashlight to provide better lighting. Where did you say your shop was? Toledo, James replied, carefully wrapping the silicone tape around the damaged hose. Wilson's Foreign Auto Repair. Wasn't much to look at, but we had a good reputation. People would drive from 3 states away for major repairs. What happened? The question was simple, but loaded. James's hands stilled for a moment before continuing their work. Life happened. My wife got sick, pancreatic cancer. Insurance covered some of it, but you know how it goes. Sold the shop to pay for treatments, but it wasn't enough. After she passed, the debts kept piling up. One thing led to another, and well, he gestured vaguely at himself. The rain had slowed to a drizzle now, but neither man seemed to notice. There was something almost surreal about the scene. A billionaire and a homeless man standing in the rain, discussing cars and life's cruel turns. How long have you been? Musk trailed off, seemingly unsure how to phrase the question. On the streets. James finished for him, his tone matter-of-fact. About 3 years now. Still got my tools, though. He patted his toolbox affectionately. Some things you just can't let go of. As James made the final adjustments to his temporary fix, he found himself continuing to talk. He told Musk about the early days of his career, learning from his father in their family garage. He spoke about the satisfaction of solving complex mechanical problems, of helping people get back on the road. His voice took on a different quality when he talked about cars, more alive, more present. That should do it, he said finally, stepping back from the engine compartment. The tape will hold for a while, but you'll want to get that hose replaced properly. The repair itself is simple enough, but these parts are specifically designed for Tesla's cooling system. Musk started the car, and the angry whine had been replaced by the usual quiet hum of the electric motor. The temperature readings on the dashboard quickly returned to normal. He looked at James with newfound respect. "How much do I owe you?" he asked, reaching for his wallet. James shook his head. "Nothing. Just glad I could help." He began packing up his tools, each one going back into its designated spot in the box. Besides, it's not every day you get to work on a Tesla. Musk was quiet for a moment, studying the older man with an intensity that made James slightly uncomfortable. "You said you've kept up with electric vehicle technology." "Had to," James replied, closing his toolbox. "World keeps moving forward. Can't fix what you don't understand." As he prepared to return to his spot under the overhang, Musk called out, "Wait." James turned back, expecting perhaps a token of gratitude or a small tip. What he got instead was a question that would change everything. "Would you be interested in doing that full-time again?" James stood there in the drizzling rain, wondering if he'd heard correctly. The words full-time echoed in his mind like a distant bell. He gripped his toolbox tighter, its familiar weight keeping him grounded in reality. "I don't understand," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "Are you offering me a job?" Musk leaned against the Tesla, seemingly unbothered by the rain that had soaked through his expensive suit. "Let's call it an opportunity. But first, I want to see more of what you can do." He pulled out his phone, fingers moving rapidly across the screen. "I've got a meeting I can't miss, but afterward, would you be willing to show me more of your expertise?" James felt a spark of something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope, mixed with professional pride. "What did you have in mind?" "There's a Tesla service center not far from here. They've got a few challenging cases that have been puzzling our younger technicians. I'd like to see how you'd approach them." Musk's eyes held a curious intensity. "Consider it an interview of sorts." The old James would have jumped at the chance immediately. But 3 years on the streets had taught him caution. "Mr. Musk, I appreciate the offer, but," he gestured to his weathered clothes, "I'm not exactly dressed for a job interview." "Let me worry about that," Musk replied, already typing something else on his phone. "Can you be ready in 3 hours? That'll give me time to finish my meeting and make some arrangements." James looked down at his toolbox, then back at the Tesla with its temporarily patched cooling system. The rational part of his mind told him this was crazy. Things like this didn't happen in real life. But then again, nothing about this night had been normal. "Yes," he heard himself say. "I'll be ready." Musk nodded, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "My assistant will pick you up right here. And James?" He paused, making sure he had the older man's attention. bring your tools. I have a feeling you're going to need them." After Musk drove away, James returned to his spot under the overhang. The next 3 hours felt like the longest of his life. He spent them meticulously cleaning each of his tools, though they were already well maintained. The familiar routine helped calm his nerves. As promised, exactly 3 hours later, a black SUV pulled up to the curb. A young woman in a crisp suit stepped out, holding an umbrella and a large garment bag. "Mr. Wilson, I'm Mr. Musk's assistant. We've got about 40 minutes to get you ready." The next half hour passed in a blur. The garment bag contained a new set of clothes, nothing flashy but clean and professional. James changed in the back of the SUV, which had been fitted with privacy screens. The clothes fit perfectly, making him wonder when and how they'd gotten his measurements. When they arrived at the Tesla service center, James barely recognized himself in the reflection of the building's glass doors. The new clothes helped, but it was something else too. The way he carried himself had changed, like he was slowly remembering who he used to be. Inside, Musk was waiting with 3 other people, all wearing Tesla technical uniforms. "James," he greeted, "ready to show us what you know." The service center was a mechanic's dream, spotlessly clean, with state-of-the-art equipment everywhere. But what caught James' attention were the 3 vehicles parked in separate bays, each with their hoods up and diagnostic equipment attached. "These are our problem children," one of the technicians explained. "Each one has an issue that's been stumping us for days." James set his toolbox down and approached the first vehicle. This was familiar territory. This was what he'd done for over 40 years. As he began his inspection, the rest of the world faded away. It was just him and the machines now. The first car had an intermittent power delivery issue that the computer couldn't seem to pinpoint. James started with the basics, checking connections, testing voltage levels. Then he noticed something subtle, a slight discoloration on one of the main power distribution cables. "Your diagnostic computer won't catch this," he explained, pointing to the spot. "The insulation is breaking down internally. It's causing micro-interruptions in power flow, but only under specific conditions." He looked up at the amazed faces of the younger technicians. "I've seen similar issues in other high-voltage systems. The cable looks fine from the outside, but..." He moved to the second car, then the third, approaching each with the same methodical precision. For each problem, he not only identified the cause, but explained his reasoning, drawing on decades of experience to connect seemingly unrelated symptoms. As he worked, James found himself sharing stories from his years in the shop, tricks he'd learned, unusual cases he'd solved. The younger technicians gathered around, asking questions, taking notes. Even Musk stood watching, his expression thoughtful. "The technology may be new," James explained as he traced a complex routing of cooling lines, "but the principles haven't changed. Heat is still heat. Electricity is still electricity. The trick is learning to listen to what the machine is telling you." It was nearly midnight when he finished with the last car. His clothes were slightly smudged with grease now, but he felt more alive than he had in years. This was what he was meant to do, not just fixing cars, but sharing knowledge, solving puzzles, making things work. Musk had been quiet for the last hour, just observing. Now he stepped forward, looking at James with newfound respect. "I've seen enough," he said. Then he turned to his assistant. "Get the paperwork ready. All of it. Employment contract, housing assistance, healthcare, everything we discussed." James's hands froze on the wrench he was cleaning. "Mr. Musk, I..." "Just Elon," Musk interrupted. "And before you say anything else, this isn't charity. What I just watched was a masterclass in mechanical troubleshooting. We need that kind of expertise, especially with someone who can bridge the gap between traditional automotive knowledge and new technology." He paused, making sure he had James's full attention. "But I'm not just offering you a job as a technician. I have something bigger in mind. Something that could help a lot of people who found themselves in situations similar to yours." The Tesla service center had grown quiet, with most of the staff having gone home for the night. Only the soft hum of overhead lights and the occasional beat from diagnostic equipment broke the silence. James sat across from Elon Musk in what appeared to be a break room, his hands wrapped around a cup of hot coffee, his first proper cup in what felt like forever. "Tell me more about your shop," Musk said, leaning back in his chair. He'd loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves, looking more like a curious colleague than a billionaire CEO. What made you decide to specialize in foreign cars? James took a sip of coffee, savoring the warmth. It wasn't really a decision at first. Back in the 80s, this guy brought in a BMW that 3 other shops couldn't fix. I spent 2 days studying the manual, figured out the problem, and after that, word just spread. He smiled at the memory. Pretty soon, we had people driving in from Michigan, Indiana, even Kentucky. And your wife worked with you? Musk asked gently. Linda, James said softly, and for a moment, the pain in his voice was raw and fresh. She handled the books, kept me organized. Had a way with customers too, could calm down even the angriest person with just a few kind words. He set his coffee cup down, his hands trembling slightly. When she got sick, it happened so fast. One day she was complaining about stomach pain, and 6 months later, he trailed off, looking down at his hands, clean now, but still bearing the tiny scars and calluses of 40 years of mechanical work. The insurance covered the basics, but she needed specialized treatments. Experimental stuff. Our policy wouldn't touch it. So I started selling things, first the house, then the shop equipment, piece by piece. Kept enough to do basic repairs, but... You were trying to save her, Musk said quietly. Wouldn't anyone? James looked up, his eyes bright with unched tears. 37 years of marriage. She was everything to me. The shop, the house, my reputation, none of it mattered if it meant giving her a fighting chance. Musk nodded, something shifting in his expression. My mother always said you can tell everything about a person by how they handle loss. Some people let it break them. Others end up living on the streets, James said with a hint of bitter humor. Others keep their dignity, Musk corrected. Keep their skills sharp. Help strangers in the rain, even when they have nothing to gain from it. James absently touched the sleeve of his new shirt. You know, the hardest part wasn't losing the material things. It was losing my purpose. Every morning in the shop, I knew exactly who I was and what I was meant to do. These past 3 years, I felt invisible, like I don't exist anymore. Yet you kept your tools, Musk observed. Couldn't let them go, James admitted. Silly, really. Could have sold them for good money, maybe gotten a few months' rent somewhere. But they were like, I don't know, like a connection to who I used to be. Some guys on the street carry photos of their families. I carried socket wrenches and multimeters. The conversation paused as Musk's assistant brought in more coffee and some sandwiches. James couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten proper food, but he tried to pace himself, maintaining the dignity that had carried him through the worst years of his life. You mentioned earlier that you've been following the development of electric vehicles, Musk said after a while. What got you interested in that? James's eyes lit up slightly. I could see where things were heading. Started reading everything I could find about electric motors, battery systems. Used to go to the library, spend hours on their computers studying technical papers. The librarians probably thought I was crazy, this homeless guy obsessing over electrical engineering journals. And what do you think about where the technology is going? It's amazing, James said, genuine enthusiasm in his voice. The power management systems, the regenerative braking, the thermal regulation, it's like everything I learned about traditional mechanics, but evolved. Though I have to say, he added with a small grin, your cooling system design could use some tweaking. Musk laughed. A genuine surprised sound. You know, you're not the first person to point that out, but you might be the first to fix it with electrical tape in the rain. Silicone tape, James corrected automatically. Rated for high-temperature applications, regular electrical tape would have melted. They'd both chuckled, and for a moment, they were just two mechanics talking shop, the vast gulf between their life circumstances temporarily forgotten. James, Musk said finally, his tone becoming serious. What would you say if I told you I think you could help us solve bigger problems than just broken cars? What kind of problems? We have the technology, the facilities, the resources. But there's something missing, something that became very clear to me watching you work tonight. We need people who can bridge the gap between the old and the new. People who understand both worlds. James frowned slightly. I'm not sure I follow. There are thousands of experienced mechanics out there who are struggling to adapt to electric vehicles. And there are brilliant young engineers who've never had their hands dirty in an engine bay. But you? Musk leaned forward. You speak both languages. And more importantly, you know what it's like to fall through the cracks of society. To lose everything and still keep your skills, your dignity. What exactly are you suggesting? I'm suggesting, Musk said, that you might be exactly what we need to help create something new. A program that could give people a second chance, while also helping us build the future of transportation. But before we get into the details, he glanced at his watch. It's late and you look exhausted. How about we continue this conversation tomorrow, after you've had a proper night's rest? James looked down at his empty coffee cup, suddenly aware of how tired he really was. I should probably get back to my... He hesitated, the word spot sticking in his throat. Already taken care of, Musk said, nodding to his assistant who had reappeared at the door. We've arranged a hotel room for you. Clean clothes, hot shower, real bed. Tomorrow, we can talk about making it more permanent. James felt overwhelmed, his emotions threatening to spill over. Why? He asked simply. Why are you doing all this? Musk stood up, straightening his tie. Because tonight you reminded me of something important. Sometimes the best way to build the future is to remember the wisdom of the past. Now he smiled, get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a big day. The next morning arrived like a dream. James woke up confused, his hand reaching instinctively for his toolbox before remembering where he was. The hotel room was modest but felt like pure luxury after 3 years on the streets. Sunlight streamed through real curtains, and for the first time in years, he'd slept on a real bed. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror, hardly recognizing himself. The hotel room had come with basic toiletries, a razor, toothbrush, comb. He'd spent nearly an hour the night before getting properly clean, watching years of street life wash down the drain. Now, with his beard neatly trimmed and wearing the fresh clothes that had been provided, he looked almost like his old self. Almost. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted his collar. The clothes were simple but good quality: khaki pants, a blue button-down shirt, comfortable work boots. Practical clothes, working clothes. They felt like a costume and like coming home, all at the same time. A knock at the door made him jump. It was Musk's assistant, right on time as promised. Good morning, Mr. Wilson. I hope you slept well. Are you ready to head to the Tesla headquarters? The drive through morning traffic felt surreal. San Francisco looked different from inside a car, more familiar, more like the city he'd known before everything fell apart. His toolbox sat beside him on the seat, cleaned and polished the night before until every surface gleamed. Mr. Musk asked me to give you these, the assistant said, handing him a folder. Inside were printouts about Tesla's current training programs, technical specifications for their vehicles, and something else, statistics about unemployment among skilled trades workers and the growing demand for electric vehicle technicians. The Tesla headquarters building rose up before them, all glass and steel gleaming in the morning sun. James felt his heart rate pick up. He'd been in plenty of corporate buildings before, but always as a contractor, never as whatever he was now. In the lobby, heads turned as Musk himself came to greet them. He looked fresh and energetic, as if their late-night conversation had been just a quick coffee break. James, hope you got some rest. Ready to see what we've got planned. They took an elevator to what appeared to be a conference room with a view of the city. Several other people were already there, engineers, based on their discussions, and what looked like human resources staff. James gripped his toolbox tighter, fighting the urge to shrink into himself. Everyone, this is James Wilson, Musk announced. The mechanic I was telling you about. James, why don't you have a seat? We've got some ideas we'd like to run by you. One of the engineers, a young woman with bright eyes and an eager expression, started the presentation. Mr. Wilson, we've been developing a new training program for transitioning traditional mechanics to electric vehicle service. But we've been missing something crucial, the perspective of someone who really understands both worlds. Slides appeared on a large screen showing training facilities, equipment, classrooms. James found himself leaning forward, his professional interest sparked despite his nervousness. The problem, another engineer continued, is that we're seeing a growing gap. Experienced mechanics are struggling with the transition to electric vehicles, while our younger technicians lack the fundamental mechanical intuition that comes from years of hands-on experience. Musk took over. This is where you come in, James. Last night, watching you work, seeing how you approached each problem, it was exactly what we've been missing. You don't just know how to fix things, you know how to think about fixing things. And more importantly, you know how to teach others to think that way. James looked down at his hands, clean now, but still bearing the marks of decades of honest work. I'm not sure I understand what you're asking. We want to create a bridge, Musk explained. A program that helps experienced mechanics transition to electric vehicle technology while also teaching our younger technicians the invaluable skills that can only come from years of hands-on experience. And we want you to help design it. The Human Resources Director spoke up. We're prepared to offer you a position as lead consultant for the program development. Full benefits, competitive salary, and, she paused significantly, housing assistance to help you get back on your feet. James felt overwhelmed. His throat tightened as he looked around the room, at the eager faces, the professional presentations, the view of the city where he'd been sleeping rough just yesterday. Why me? He managed to ask. Surely there are more qualified people. More qualified on paper, maybe, Musk interrupted. But you have something they don't. You understand both the technical side and the human side. You've lived through the kind of hardship that many of our potential students might be facing. Who better to help build a program about second chances than someone who needs one himself? A silence fell over the room. James could feel tears threatening at the corners of his eyes, but he blinked them back. 3 years of street life had taught him to be wary of things that seemed too good to be true. But 40 years of solving mechanical problems had also taught him to recognize genuine opportunities when they appeared. He opened his toolbox, running his fingers over the familiar implements inside. Each tool had a story, each mark and scratch a memory of a problem solved, a lesson learned. Maybe it was time to put them to use in a different way. I need to understand more about what you're planning, he said finally, his voice steady despite his emotions. And I want to make sure that whatever we create really helps people, not just with jobs, but with rebuilding their lives. Musk smiled. That's exactly why we want you involved. This isn't just about training mechanics. It's about giving people back their dignity, their purpose, just like you never lost yours, even when you lost everything else. The morning sun caught the chrome of James's tools, sending little sparkles of light dancing across the conference room walls. It felt like a sign, like his old life and his potential new one meeting in a moment of perfect clarity. When do we start? He asked. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity. James found himself in a temporary office at Tesla headquarters, surrounded by notebooks, technical manuals, and computers. His toolbox sat in its usual spot beside his desk, a reminder of where he'd come from and where he was going. The company had set him up in a modest but comfortable apartment near the office. Each morning, he would wake up still expecting to see the underside of his old overhang, only to find himself in a real bed with a roof over his head and hot coffee brewing in the kitchen. Today was different, though. Today was the day he would present his vision for the training program to the executive team. He adjusted his new tie, still strange around his neck after so many years without one, and looked over his notes one more time. Ready? Musk asked, poking his head into the office. Everyone's waiting in the conference room. James gathered his materials, including several pieces of equipment he'd requested for the demonstration. His hands were steady now, the nervousness replaced by the certainty that came from knowing exactly what needed to be done. The conference room was packed. Board members, engineers, training coordinators, and even some current Tesla technicians filled the seats. James moved to the front of the room, setting up his equipment with the same careful precision he'd once used in his shop. "Good morning," he began, his voice stronger than he expected. "For the past week, I've been reviewing your current training programs and thinking about what's missing. The problem isn't just technical, it's human." He picked up a traditional wrench from his toolbox. "When I started as a mechanic, this was all you needed to understand." He set it down and picked up a diagnostic tablet. "Now you need this too. But the real challenge isn't teaching people to use either tool, it's teaching them to think in new ways while valuing what they already know." As he spoke, James's natural teaching ability began to shine through. He explained his vision for a program that would combine hands-on mechanical experience with cutting-edge technology. But more than that, he spoke about dignity, about the importance of making people feel value for their existing skills while helping them build new ones. Many of the mechanics we want to reach are struggling, he explained. Some have lost their shops to changing technology. Others can't afford the training they need to stay competitive. They're facing the same fears I faced, becoming obsolete, losing everything they've worked for. He brought out a partially disassembled Tesla power control unit. Look at this. To a traditional mechanic, it's intimidating, all circuit boards and high-voltage warnings. To a young tech person, it's fascinating but maybe a bit abstract. The key is showing both groups how their knowledge connects. James demonstrated, pointing out how traditional mechanical principles apply to the new technology. He showed how years of diagnostic experience could combine with modern computer analysis to solve problems more effectively than either approach alone. But here's the most important part, he continued, his voice growing passionate. This program can't just be about technical training, it needs to be about rebuilding lives. Every person who comes through these doors needs to know they have value, that their experience matters, that they're not being left behind by progress, but are essential to making it work. He outlined his proposal, a comprehensive program that would include not just technical training, but also housing assistance, financial counseling, and job placement support. Traditional mechanics would be paired with young tech experts, learning from each other while working on real problems. I envision a scholarship program, he said, looking directly at Musk, targeting experienced mechanics who've fallen on hard times. Give them not just training, but a real chance to rebuild their lives. In return, they become mentors, sharing decades of practical knowledge with the next generation. The room had grown quiet, captivated by the simple wisdom in his words. Even the board members were leaning forward, taking notes. The cost would be significant, one of them pointed out. The return would be greater, James countered. Think about it, you're not just creating technicians, you're preserving decades of practical experience that can't be learned from a manual. You're building a workforce that understands both the past and the future of transportation. He touched his toolbox gently. Every tool in here has a story, represents a problem solved, a lesson learned. I'm not the only one out there with this kind of experience. There are thousands of skilled mechanics who just need a bridge to the future. We can build that bridge. Musk stood up, a broad smile on his face. I've had enough. The board can review the details, but I'm approved this program effective immediately. James, how soon can you start putting together your team? James blinked, momentarily stunned. You mean? I mean we're doing this. All of it, the training program, the scholarships, the support services, everything you proposed. And we want you to lead it. The room erupted in applause, but James barely heard it. His mind was already racing with possibilities, with all the lives they could change, all the knowledge they could preserve and pass on. There's just one more thing, Musk added, holding up a hand for quiet. We need a name for the program. James looked at his toolbox one more time, thinking of all it had represented during his darkest days. Hope, dignity, purpose. Then he smiled. Let's call it BridgeWorks, he said, because that's what we're really building. A bridge between experience and innovation, between past and future, between loss and hope. Musk nodded approvingly. Perfect. Welcome aboard, Director Wilson. The title hit James like a physical thing. Director Wilson. From homeless mechanic to program director in less than a week. But as he looked around the room, at all the eager faces waiting to help make his vision reality, he knew this was just the beginning. His hand found his toolbox again, and he smiled. Some tools were meant for fixing cars. Others were meant for fixing lives. Maybe, just maybe, he could do both. 6 months had passed since that rainy night when James had fixed a Tesla by streetlight. Standing in front of the mirror in his new apartment, he straightened his name badge. James Wilson, Director of BridgeWorks Training Program. Sometimes he still couldn't believe how much his life had changed. The morning sun streamed through his window as he picked up his trusty toolbox. He'd been offered a new one, of course, but he kept his old tools. They were more than just implements now. They were a reminder of where he'd come from and what he'd overcome. Today was a big day. The first official class of BridgeWorks was starting, and 20 former mechanics would be walking through those doors, each carrying their own stories of struggle and hope. James had personally reviewed every application, looking not just for technical skills, but for that spark of determination he recognized from his own journey. The training center was a thing of beauty. Tesla had converted an old warehouse into a state-of-the-art facility with traditional mechanical workshops on one side and advanced electronic diagnostic stations on the other. In the middle was what James called the fusion zone, where old-school knowledge met cutting-edge technology. He arrived early, walking through the empty workshop. The tools were all laid out, perfectly organized. Traditional wrenches set next to high-tech diagnostic tablets. The walls were lined with Q2A displays showing both conventional engines and electric powertrains. Everything was designed to make the transition less intimidating, to show how old skills could adapt to new challenges. Morning, Director Wilson called out one of the young tech trainers as she came in. She was part of the teaching team, brilliant with computers but eager to learn from the experienced mechanics who would be joining them. That was the heart of Bridgeworks. Everyone was both teacher and student. The first students began arriving, and James's heart swelled as he watched them. Some came in old work clothes, others in their Sunday best. All carried their own toolboxes, just as he had. He could see the same uncertainty in their eyes that he felt 6 months ago, the same mix of hope and fear. "Welcome to Bridgeworks," he began, his voice carrying across the workshop floor. "I know what you're feeling right now. 6 months ago, I was sleeping under an overpass, holding onto my toolbox because it was the last piece of who I used to be. Now I'm standing here, not because of luck, but because someone saw value in experience, in hard work, in the knowledge that comes from decades of solving problems." He walked over to one of the workstations, picking up both a traditional wrench and a diagnostic tablet. "These aren't competing tools, they're complementary. Just like your experience isn't outdated, it's foundational. We're not here to replace what you know, we're here to build on it." As he spoke, he could see shoulders relaxing, heads nodding. These were his people, men and women who had spent their lives fixing things, solving problems, helping others get back on the road. They just needed a chance to prove they could adapt. "Look around you," he continued. "Every person in this room has a story. Some of you lost your shops to changing times. Others couldn't afford to keep up with new technology. Maybe you've been sleeping in your cars, or staying with family, or wondering if your skills still have value in this new world. I'm here to tell you they do." He gestured to the young tech trainers standing nearby. "These talented young people are here to help you understand the new technology. But they're also here to learn from you, to understand the things that can only be learned through years of hands-on experience. This isn't just a training program, it's a partnership." The day unfolded like a dream. James watched as experienced mechanics cautiously approached the electric vehicles, their faces lighting up as they recognized familiar principles in new forms. The young trainers were amazed by how quickly the older mechanics grasped complex systems once they were explained in familiar terms. During the lunch break, James slipped away to a quiet corner. He pulled out an old photo from his wallet, him and Linda standing in front of their shop, both smiling. "We did it, honey," he whispered. "We're helping people again." Later that afternoon, Elon Musk dropped by to see how things were going. He found James helping a former diesel mechanic understand the thermal management system in a Tesla battery pack. "How's it going?" Musk asked, watching the natural way James moved between the old and new technologies. "Better than we hoped," James replied. "These folks just needed a chance. The knowledge was always there. They just needed a bridge to cross over to the new world." Musk nodded, looking around at the busy workshop. "You know, when I saw you fix my car that night, I thought I was just meeting a skilled mechanic. Instead, I found someone who could help us solve one of our biggest challenges." James smiled, watching a young trainer and an experienced mechanic high-five after successfully diagnosing a complex problem. "Sometimes the best solutions come from unexpected places," he said, "or from under overpasses." As the day drew to a close, James stood in front of his first class one more time. "Tomorrow, we'll dig deeper into the technical stuff. But tonight, I want you to remember something. Every one of you has value. Every bit of knowledge you've gained over the years matters. We're not just learning about electric vehicles here. We're building a future where experience and innovation work together." He picked up his old toolbox, holding it up. "This got me through the hardest time in my life, not just because of the tools inside, but because it reminded me of who I was, what I could do. Now it's your turn. Take what you know, add to it, and help us build something new." As the students filed out, many with a new spring in their step, James stayed behind in the workshop. He ran his hand along his workbench, feeling the smooth surface under his fingers. 6 months ago, he'd been wondering where he would sleep. Now he was helping others rebuild their lives. His phone buzzed, a message from Musk. "Ready to start planning the next training center. Other cities are interested in bridge works." James smiled, picking up his toolbox. Some tools fixed engines, some fixed lives. And sometimes, if you were lucky, you got to do both. Walking out into the evening air, he passed the spot where he used to sleep. Someone new was there now, huddled under a blanket. James paused, then walked over, pulling out one of the Bridgeworks business cards he carried. "Hey," he said softly, "if you're interested in a fresh start, come see me tomorrow." Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to give you a chance. As he walked to his car, James looked up at the stars, finally visible through the city's lights. He'd come full circle, from success to rock bottom and back again. But this time, he wasn't just rebuilding engines, he was helping rebuild lives, one person at a time. And that, he realized, was the greatest fix of all.